Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something incredibly sensitive, a really complex system. How an adverse medical event becomes a formal malpractice claim.
Right. And our sources suggest the common idea that it all starts with some clear, obvious act of negligence is, well, it's often just wrong.
Yeah, for most people, negligence is a smoking gun, a clear mistake. But what this deep dive shows is that a lot of these claims, they actually start with something much more confusing, an unexpected outcome.
Exactly. A known surgical risk, one that was probably even discussed, suddenly becomes real. It's catastrophic. And that abstract possibility, it transforms into this deeply personal, irreversible tragedy.
And that's what we're tracking today.
That transformation is the whole story. Our mission here is to trace that journey, that predictable path from a bad outcome to a hardened public story of fault. We really want to understand how the line between a complication, something that can just happen, and true negligence gets so completely blurred.
So we're looking for the moment the legal claim is actually born.
We are.
Yeah.
And it's usually this convergence of grief, of crippling uncertainty, and this institutional silence. It all comes together, and a narrative gets built to just make it all make sense.
Okay, let's break that down. Phase one then, the internal narrative shift. This is right in the thick of it, the immediate aftermath.
The shock is a psychological tripwire. I mean, before the surgery, everyone agreed on the risks, right? Consent forms were signed.
You know it's a possibility, intellectually.
Intellectually, yes. But when that complication hits, the massive bleed, the post-op infection, that whole intellectual framework just shatters. The brain is scrambling for a category, and bad luck just doesn't cut it.
And that's exactly when they need information the most. But the system just clams up, this vacuum of silence. Our sources say this is maybe the most destructive part.
It's absolutely corrosive. Surgical timelines stretch out, updates get vague, less frequent. And even if the delays are, clinically ordinary for a tough case, the lack of clear, constant communication lets fear just rush in and fill that gap.
But why can't the team just come out and say, look, we don't know everything yet, but here's exactly what we're doing to find out?
Well, because the whole legal system has incentivized silence. Doctors and hospitals they're coached to be so careful with their words to not jump to conclusions.
Right, to avoid admitting liability before they even know what happened.
Exactly. But the family doesn't hear caution. They hear evasion. They hear they're hiding something. And the question immediately flips from a clinical what happened to a much more accusatory who did this.
Okay, and this is where the story gets its first real villain, so to speak.
Yeah.
The informal authority. This is just fascinating. We've all seen this, right? The family member who works in healthcare.
Oh, yes. The retired nurse, the cousin who's a paramedic.
And they have just enough medical literacy to be dangerous, especially because they're also in a state of, total emotional distress.
That's the perfect storm. While they're grieving and confused, their one frustrated comment, something like, well, that doesn't make any sense, or on my floor, we never do it that way, it carries this huge, disproportionate weight.
So they're like an internal expert, giving the family permission to be suspicious.
That's it. That one offhand comment becomes the shorthand for negligence. It doesn't matter what the facts are. Rarity doesn't equal fault. But in that moment of crisis, the allegation is born not from evidence, but from the gut feeling of a grieving relative.
And while all this is happening on the family side, the hospital is kicking its own processes into gear. Risk management, M&M conferences, peer review.
Right, all these things designed to figure out what happened, but they take time, weeks sometimes.
And the family doesn't see a careful process.
No, they see delay. They see strategic avoidance, and this is critical. When the physicians who are managing the care start to step back a little because of protocol or even just emotional exhaustion, the family feels abandoned.
That feeling of abandonment must just pour gasoline on the fire.
It does, because that experience of being deserted is what fuels the idea of a cover-up. The institution thinks it's acting responsibly, but the family just feels like they've been left alone in the dark.
Which brings us to phase two. The story is starting to harden, and now it's going to get amplified.
Exactly. Narrative hardening and external amplification.
And the story has to harden, doesn't it? What started as a complication becomes a preventable error. Then it's negligence, and soon enough, it's like a full-blown systemic corruption story.
Yeah.
Why does it need to escalate like that?
Because the alternative, that this terrible thing happened despite everyone doing their best, is just psychologically unbearable. It offers no meaning, no accountability, no relief from grief.
Random bad luck is a terrible story.
It's an empty story. Blame provides structure. It gives you a villain, a reason for the pain, and grief just craves that structure.
So once that story solidifies and leaves the hospital, it just explodes, right? Social reinforcement kicks in.
Absolutely. The narrative hits online support groups, Facebook pages, and these places offer immediate validation, certainty. Stories from other people, even if they're not medically similar at all, are shared not to be analyzed, but just as proof.
Confirmation.
Pure confirmation.
Yeah.
And through repetition, the allegation becomes an assumption, and the assumption becomes fact. All without a shred of actual evidence.
And that's the echo chamber effect. And then, of course, the press gets involved.
And that's the real accelerant.
Media attention. Reporters are on a deadline. They need a compelling story. And what's more compelling than raw human emotion? Outrage, loss, fear. Much easier to report on that than on, complex surgical findings.
And that emotional weight starts to substitute for actual evidence. By the time it's on the nightly news, the question isn't even if the standard of care was breached anymore.
Right. The question becomes, is our hospital safe? It's a really effective framing, but it's built on fear, not fact.
Profoundly corrosive framing. And then it hits the final stage, the legislature.
Yeah.
This is where the story becomes almost permanent.
Lawmakers see the story in its most distilled form. A grieving family, a sympathetic news report, an advocacy group demanding change now.
And being human, they respond with empathy. But they aren't medical experts. They rarely ask about the status of the investigation or complication rates. They just absorb the human pain and the political pressure that comes with it.
And that's the point of failure, according to the source.
Yes. Because once those stories get entered into the legislative record, they gain this permanence that later facts like autopsy results or board findings can almost never undo. The policy gets built on the story of guilt, not the evidence of what actually happened.
So that brings us to phase 3. If the system is broken, if it allows grief to outrun process, what can be done? What are these points of intervention?
Well, the key failure, again, is the system's inability to just clearly explain its own investigative process. Legal caution creates a vacuum, and families fill it with conspiracy theories. We need systems that reward careful process over narrative speed.
So our sources propose 5 points of procedural friction. Mechanisms to slow things down until the facts are in. Let's start with the first 2, about what the hospital can do.
Okay, intervention 1 is all about communicating uncertainty early and explicitly. Hospitals need to be required to name it.
So instead of, we're monitoring closely, they should be saying, what?
Something like, a serious complication has occurred. This requires a formal review, and here is a map of exactly what that review process looks like and when you can expect updates.
So you're not giving them answers you don't have, you're giving them a process.
You're anchoring them to a process. If you name the uncertainty and put a structure around it, it's much harder for suspicion to fill that space. They need to know what happens next.
Okay, that makes sense. And intervention 2.
This is about separating explanation from fault. We have to formally decouple the clinical explanation from the legal determination of fault. The source even suggests making the results of things like an M&M conference transparent to the family.
Wait, really? How can they share internal peer review findings without just admitting fault and getting sued instantly?
Well, the system has to change to allow it. The goal would be to share what the clinical team believes happened, step by step, while making it clear that only a court can determine legal fault. If you show the family how you're seeking the truth, they're less likely to believe you're hiding it.
That would be a massive change. Okay, what about the external forces, the advocacy groups?
Right, intervention 3. Advocacy groups are vital for support, but when they go to a lawmaker, they often present an allegation as a hard fact. The source says they're essentially laundering grief into policy through ambiguity.
That's a strong phrase.
It is. So the reform would require them to include a clear disclosure of the case's evidentiary status. Is this an established fact from a court? Is it just an allegation in a lawsuit? Legislators need to know if they're hearing findings or feelings.
You're putting friction into the system before emotion can just become policy, which leads to number 4, the legislative process itself.
Yes. If personal testimony is that powerful, it needs a counterbalance. Intervention 4 suggests that legislative hearings with personal stories should also include neutral expert briefings.
To explain the medical side of it.
Exactly. Explain the standard of care, the typical risks, the difference between a bad outcome and bad medicine. Testimony is for human impact, but it can't be a substitute for facts when you're writing law.
Which brings us to the final and maybe the toughest point, media accountability.
Intervention 5. This addresses what the source calls the civic injury. That's what happens when the media reports unverified claims as settled truth.
A civic injury. That's not just harm to the people involved, that's harm to the public trust.
Precisely. It distorts public understanding, it erodes trust, and it forces policy to be made based on outrage, not on data. The journalist effectively becomes the judge and jury.
But how do you hold the press accountable without, threatening freedom of the press?
It's not about censorship. It's about ethical transparency. Journalists should be required to clearly state the evidentiary status of a claim. An allegation has to be labeled an allegation. You can't just edit out the uncertainty because it makes for a better story. The source says, free press does not mean unexamined press.
This whole deep dive really lays it bare. The path to a malpractice claim is so much less about the medical facts and so much more about failures in communication. So to sum it up for you, the listener, the key insight here is that systems don't fail because people grieve. They fail because grief is allowed to outrun process.
That's the heart of it. Structural reform isn't about silencing victims. It's about preserving the right sequence. Investigation first, conclusion second, and policy last. If we can enforce that sequence, this whole corrosive cycle starts to lose its power.
And that leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to take away. When you see social media movements focused on medical issues that seem to push out experts, that suppress any internal questions, and that elevate a leader's certainty over actual inquiry, are they really advancing accountability?
Or are they just corroding it? Are they focusing on emotionally satisfying villains instead of tackling the really hard, demonstrable, systemic failures?
Yeah.
It's a critical question. Are we after justice or just the quickest story to explain our pain?
Something to think about. That's our deep dive for today. We'll see you next time.